A miller's son died in 1669 and changed how humans see light forever. Not because he painted pretty pictures, but because he discovered something in shadows that nobody else could find. His name was Rembrandt van Rijn, and by the time he was finished, he'd lost everything he owned, buried 4 children, faced scandal, and created work so revolutionary that we're still trying to understand how he did it. This isn't a story about artistic genius overcoming adversity. It's stranger than that. It's about a man who got worse at playing the game everyone else was playing, yet somehow became greater because of it. Let's start with something that doesn't make sense. In 1606, the 9th child of a miller was born in Leiden, a city in the Dutch Republic you've probably never heard of. His parents, Harmen Gerritsoen van Rijn and Neeltgen Willemsdochter van Suitbroek, weren't poor, but they weren't wealthy either. His father ground grain for a living. His mother came from a family of bakers. These were practical people who understood work and survival, not art. Here's where it gets interesting. Most families in their position would push their children toward practical trades. But Rembrandt's mother did something different. She read scripture to her children constantly. Not as religious duty, but as story, as drama, as a way of understanding human nature. This matters more than you'd think, because later, when Rembrandt painted biblical scenes, he wouldn't paint them the way everyone else did. He'd paint them like he was watching real people in real moments, because that's how his mother had taught him to see them. At age 10, Rembrandt entered the Latin school in Leiden. Classical education, biblical texts, oratory, the kind of schooling designed to produce scholars and theologians. Then something remarkable happened. In 1620, at 14 years old, he enrolled at the University of Leiden. For a miller's son, this was almost unheard of. Universities were for the wealthy, for future lawyers and doctors and church officials. The fact that Rembrandt even got in tells you something about his family's ambition for him. And then he quit. His first biographer, a man named Aulers, wrote that Rembrandt left because he was by nature moved toward the art of painting and drawing. But that explanation is too simple. Think about what he was walking away from. A university education in the 17th century was a guaranteed path to security, to respect, to a comfortable life. Art was risky, competitive, and most artists never made enough money to support themselves. Yet Rembrandt looked at this choice and decided to take the harder path. He found a teacher named Jacob Isaacs van Swanenburg. For 3 years, from age 14 to 17, Rembrandt learned the fundamentals: how to prepare a canvas, how to mix pigments, how to see composition and structure. But here's what's crucial. Van Swanenburg wasn't a great painter. He was competent, technical, but not exceptional. And maybe that was exactly what Rembrandt needed. He learned the mechanics without having a dominant, artistic personality, crushing his own emerging style. After 3 years, Rembrandt made a decision that would define his career. He left for Amsterdam. 6 months. That's all he spent with his next teacher, Peter Lastman, who was the most important history painter of the day. 6 months seems too short to learn much, but Lastman specialised in something specific: dramatic narrative scenes, filled with detail, emotion, and theatrical gesture. Rembrandt absorbed this like a sponge, but he didn't stay long enough to become a copy of his teacher. Then he did something unusual. He went back to Leiden. Most ambitious young artists would have stayed in Amsterdam, the commercial centre, where the money and commissions were. Rembrandt returned to his provincial hometown and opened a studio. He was either incredibly confident or incredibly naive, possibly both. He shared the studio with Jan Levens, a friend and fellow artist. They were the same age, similarly talented, and for a while they pushed each other forward. Contemporary sources suggest they were rivals as much as collaborators, each trying to outdo the other. This competition was productive. It forced Rembrandt to develop faster, to take risks, to find his own voice rather than imitating what was popular. By 1627, at age 21, Rembrandt was teaching his own students. Think about that timeline. He'd only been studying painting seriously for 6 years, and now other artists were paying him to teach them. One of his early students was Gerrit Douw, who would go on to become one of the most successful Dutch painters of the century. The fact that someone of Douw's talent sought out Rembrandt while he was still in his early 20s tells you something about the reputation he was already building. But the real turning point came in 1629 when Rembrandt met Constantijn Huygens. Huygens was a statesman, a diplomat, a poet, and an art connoisseur who served the princes of Orange. He was connected to everyone who mattered in Dutch society, and he saw something in Rembrandt's work that excited him. Specifically, he saw paintings that handled emotion and psychological depth in ways that other Dutch artists weren't attempting. Huygens wrote about Rembrandt and Leiden, comparing them to the great Italian masters. This was extraordinary praise for two artists in their early 20s working in a provincial Dutch city. But here's what's interesting. Huygens also criticised them. He said they were too provincial, too unwilling to travel to Italy to study the classical masters firsthand. He thought they were limiting themselves by staying in the Netherlands. Rembrandt ignored this advice. He never went to Italy, never studied in Rome or Florence or Venice. This was considered almost mandatory for serious artists at the time. The Grand Tour, the exposure to classical antiquity and Renaissance masterpieces, was seen as essential education. Rembrandt looked at this tradition and decided he didn't need it. He'd learn what he needed from prints, from copies, from the classical sculptures and Italian paintings that made their way to the Netherlands. Everything he needed was within reach if he looked carefully enough. This decision reveals something fundamental about how Rembrandt thought. He wasn't interested in following the prescribed path to success. He was interested in developing his own vision, even if that meant ignoring what everyone else considered necessary. During these Leiden years, from 1625 to 1631, Rembrandt's style was developing rapidly. His paintings were small, packed with detail, focused on costumes and jewellery and surface texture. He painted religious scenes and allegorical subjects. He also painted tronies, which were character studies, faces expressing specific emotions or types. These weren't portraits of real people. They were explorations of human expression. One thing you notice looking at these early works is how much attention Rembrandt paid to fabric, to how light hit different textures, to the way gold gleamed or silk caught the light. He was studying surface appearance obsessively, learning how to make paint convincingly represent different materials. This technical foundation would later allow him to create effects that other painters couldn't match. Now, here's where his signature becomes important. In 1625, Rembrandt signed his earliest works with just R, or the monogram RH, for Rembrandt Harmenszoon, son of Harmen. In 1629, he started using RHL, presumably adding L for Leiden. Then in 1632, something changed. He started signing his work RHL van Rijn, then dropped that and began using just his first name, Rembrandt. The next year he added a D and stuck with Rembrandt for the rest of his career. Why does this matter? Because signing with only your first name was what the great Renaissance masters did. Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo, they were known by their first names alone, like singular figures who transcended normal identity. Rembrandt, in his mid-20s, decided he belonged in that category. This wasn't modesty. This was a declaration that he saw himself as their equal. Think about the audacity of that. A miller's son from a provincial Dutch city who'd never been to Italy, who'd studied painting for less than a decade, deciding he deserved to be mentioned in the same breath as the greatest artists in history. And the remarkable thing is, he was right. But success in Leiden had its limits. The city was respectable, comfortable, but it wasn't where the real money was. Amsterdam was the commercial heart of the Dutch Republic, crowded with merchants from every nation, wealthy beyond anything Leiden could offer. For an ambitious artist, Amsterdam represented opportunity on a completely different scale. Around 1631, Rembrandt made the move. He was 25 years old, established enough to have a reputation, young enough to rebuild his career in a new city. He lodged with Hendrik van Uylenburg, an art dealer who ran a successful business, buying, selling, and occasionally commissioning paintings. Living in an art dealer's house put Rembrandt directly into Amsterdam's commercial art network, and there he met Saskia van Uylenburg, his landlord's young cousin. The numerous paintings and drawings Rembrandt made of her suggest this was more than strategic networking. They seem to have been genuinely in love, which was fortunate because the marriage in 1634 was also strategically brilliant for Rembrandt's career. Saskia wasn't just anyone's daughter. Her father, Rombertus van Uylenburg, had been mayor of Leeuwarden in Friesland, a justice of the court of Friesland, a top lawyer, and one of the founders of the University of Franeker. Saskia came from exactly the kind of established wealthy family that could open doors for an ambitious artist. When Rembrandt married her, he wasn't just gaining a wife, he was gaining access to Amsterdam's merchant elite, the people who commissioned portraits, who bought art, who could make an artist's reputation. But here's what's interesting about the timing. Saskia was orphaned by age 12. Her mother died in 1619, her father 5 years later. By the time she married Rembrandt, she was living with relatives, connected to wealth and status, but not directly controlling it herself. The marriage connected Rembrandt to Amsterdam's elite, but in a way that didn't threaten his independence. He wasn't marrying into a family business or accepting patronage that came with strings attached. The portraits he painted of Saskia show someone who was happy. There's an intimacy in how he depicted her, a warmth that goes beyond technical skill. He painted her in different costumes, in different moods, as different characters. She became his model, his muse, his collaborator in creating images. The paintings document not just what she looked like, but what their relationship was like. Amsterdam in the 1630s was unlike anywhere else in Europe. The Dutch Republic had recently won independence from Spain, and Amsterdam was exploding economically. Trade routes to Asia, to the Americas, to Africa were making merchants wealthy beyond previous imagination. And unlike aristocratic societies where art was commissioned by kings and churches, in Amsterdam, art was bought by merchants, by guild members, by the rising middle class. This created a unique art market. Paintings weren't just decorations for palaces. They were commodities, investments, status symbols for people who'd made their money through trade. And they wanted portraits, lots of portraits. Individual portraits, family portraits, group portraits of civic guard companies and guild boards. If you could paint a good portrait in Amsterdam in the 1630s, you could make serious money. Rembrandt could paint a good portrait, better than good. He had a gift for capturing not just physical likeness, but personality, presence, the sense of a living person looking back at you. His portraits had psychological depth that other painters couldn't match, and Amsterdam's merchants were willing to pay for that quality. By the mid-1630s, Rembrandt was successful, wealthy, and famous. He was receiving more commissions than he could handle. He was teaching students who paid substantial fees. He was buying a large house, collecting art, building a reputation as one of Amsterdam's leading painters. Everything was working. The provincial miller's son had become an established master in the most prosperous city in Northern Europe. But success brought its own complications. Saskia's first pregnancy ended in tragedy. In 1636, she gave birth to their son, Rombertus, who died after only 2 weeks. Over the next 4 years, she would give birth twice more. Both children died within months. The grief must have been overwhelming, yet Rembrandt kept working, kept accepting commissions, kept painting. In 1641, Saskia gave birth again. This time, the child survived. They named him Titus, after Saskia's sister, Titia. Finally, After 3 dead infants, they had a living son, but Saskia never recovered her health. The repeated pregnancies had weakened her. In 1642, the year after Titus was born, Saskia died. She was 29 years old. Tuberculosis, probably, though the records don't specify. She was buried in the Oude Kerk, leaving Rembrandt with an infant son and a clause in her will that would complicate everything that followed. Saskia's will stipulated that Rembrandt could use Titus's inheritance, but only if he didn't remarry. If he took another wife, he'd lose access to the money. This seemed reasonable at the time, a way of protecting her son's financial future. But it meant that any future relationship Rembrandt had would exist in legal limbo, neither fully sanctioned nor entirely free. The year Saskia died, Rembrandt completed his most ambitious commission yet, the painting that would eventually be called The Night Watch, though it actually depicts a daytime scene. But that story, the one about how Rembrandt created his most famous work during the same year, he lost his wife. That's where things get complicated. The commission came in 1639, 3 years before Saskia's death. Captain Franz Banning Koch and 17 members of his civic militia company wanted a group portrait, standard practice for Amsterdam's civic guards. Each man would pay about 100 guilders for his place in the painting. Total payment, 1,600 guilders. A fortune. Group portraits had rules, unwritten but universally understood. Everyone gets equal prominence. Faces clearly visible, well lit, arranged in tidy rows or around a table. Democratic, fair, boring. Rembrandt ignored every rule. Instead of a static arrangement, he painted a scene of chaotic motion. The captain, dressed in black, issues an order to his lieutenant. The company surges into action, preparing to march. Some figures are prominently lit, others disappear into shadow. A small girl in a golden dress appears inexplicably among the armed men, carrying a chicken. Weapons bristle at odd angles. A dog barks. The whole canvas pulses with energy and disorder. The painting was massive, over 11 feet tall and 14 feet wide. Too large for Rembrandt's studio. He built a lean-to structure in his garden and painted there, working on the enormous canvas while his wife lay dying in the house. The militiamen hated it, or at least that's the legend. The story goes that they complained about not being equally visible, about being lost in shadow, about the chaotic composition that violated every convention. They refused to pay the full amount. Rembrandt's reputation suffered. The painting marked the beginning of his decline. None of that is true. The militiamen paid in full. There's no record of complaints. Rembrandt remained successful for years after completing it. But the legend persists because it fits a narrative we want to believe about genius and misunderstood artists. What is true is that the Night Watch represented something new, not just in Rembrandt's work, but in the entire tradition of Dutch group portraiture. He transformed a civic obligation into theatre, a formal record into a dramatic moment. The painting doesn't just show you who these men were, it shows you what they imagined themselves to be. The work showcases everything Rembrandt had mastered by this point. His command of light, dramatic and focused, drawing the eye to key figures while letting others recede. His handling of texture, from gleaming metal to rough fabric to soft flesh. His ability to suggest motion and energy within a static composition. And most remarkably, his skill at creating psychological complexity even in a crowded scene where most faces appear only partially. Look at the captain's hand extended toward the viewer. Foreshortened, painted with such confidence that it seems to project out of the canvas. That hand took technical mastery most painters never achieved, yet Rembrandt made it look effortless. The painting's current name, The Night Watch, came much later. In the 18th century, after centuries of dirt and varnish had darkened the canvas, people assumed the scene took place at night. It doesn't. Rembrandt painted a daytime scene, with sunlight streaming in from the left. But the name stuck, another layer of mythology surrounding the work. In 1715, when the painting was moved to Amsterdam's town hall, workers trimmed all four sides to fit it into its new location. Two figures on the left disappeared completely. The architectural framing elements, the arch and balustrade that Rembrandt had carefully included, were cut away. The composition he'd designed was permanently altered, and nobody seemed to think this mattered much. That casual destruction tells you something about how the painting was valued at the time. Important enough to keep, but not sacred. Just another old militia portrait taking up wall space. While working on this monumental commission, Rembrandt was also managing a household in crisis. Saskia was ill. The three previous children had died. Titus was an infant, requiring constant care. The house on Sint Antonisbriestraat, purchased in 1639 for 13,000 guilders, was draining resources. Rembrandt had borrowed heavily to buy it, paying only a quarter down and owing interest on the balance. The house was extraordinary. 4 stories with a large studio space, rooms for students, storage for his growing collection of art and curiosities. But it was also sinking, literally tilting on its foundation. The entire row of houses needed stabilization, and all the owners agreed to split the cost. Rembrandt didn't pay his share. This would come back to haunt him. But in 1642, none of that seemed urgent. He was at the peak of his powers, producing work that would define his legacy. The Night Watch was just one commission among many. He was also painting portraits, biblical scenes, and continuing his experiments with etching, a medium he'd mastered with unprecedented skill. His etchings from this period show an artist working at the absolute height of technical ability. The density of line, the control of tone through cross-hatching, the ability to suggest form and space with minimal means. Rembrandt's prints were collected across Europe. People who couldn't afford his paintings could buy his etchings, spreading his reputation far beyond Amsterdam. He'd also built a thriving teaching workshop. Students paid 100 guilders per year to train with him, and he was selling their work, profiting from their labour while they learned his techniques. This wasn't unusual. It was standard practice for successful masters, but Rembrandt ran his workshop on an industrial scale, teaching dozens of young painters who absorbed his style so thoroughly that their works are sometimes still mistaken for his. Then Saskia died and everything changed. Not immediately, not in obvious ways. Rembrandt kept working, kept accepting commissions, kept teaching. But something shifted internally. The paintings from the mid-1640s onward show a different sensibility, less theatrical display, more introspection, less concern with impressing viewers, more interest in psychological depth and spiritual themes. He needed help managing the household. Titus was barely a year old, requiring constant care. Rembrandt hired a woman named Geertje Dirks to serve as the child's nurse. She was a widow, practical and capable, and she became his lover. For about 6 years, Geertje lived in Rembrandt's house, caring for Titus and managing the household. She appears in no paintings, at least none that can be definitively identified. We know her primarily through legal documents, which is never a good sign. The relationship soured. Around 1647, a younger woman named Hendrikje Stoffels joined the household as a maid. She was 20 years old, 26 years younger than Rembrandt. Within a few years, it became clear that Hendrikje had replaced Geertje in Rembrandt's affections. Geertje didn't take this well. In 1649, she sued Rembrandt for breach of promise. She claimed he'd promised to marry her, given her jewellery that had belonged to Saskia, and treated her as his wife. Now he was throwing her out for a younger woman. She wanted compensation. The court sided with Geertje, awarding her 200 guilders per year. Rembrandt appealed, managed to reduce the amount slightly, but was ordered to pay. He paid for a while, then stopped. What happened next is one of the ugliest episodes in Rembrandt's life. With the cooperation of Geertje's family, Rembrandt had her committed to a house of correction in Gouda, a kind of workhouse for people deemed morally wayward. She was confined there for 5 years. Rembrandt paid the cost of her confinement. which was less than the annual support the court had ordered him to provide. The legal manoeuvring that made this possible is complex, but the essential fact is simple. Rembrandt used his resources and connections to have his former lover institutionalized rather than pay what the court had ordered. When Goethe was finally released in 1655, she died shortly after, broken by the experience. This is hard to reconcile with the empathetic artist whose paintings show such understanding of human suffering. But there it is. Rembrandt could be ruthless when his interests were threatened. The same man who painted the tenderness of parents with children, who captured the dignity of beggars and the vulnerability of the aged, also destroyed a woman who'd cared for his household and his son. Meanwhile, Hendrikje remained. She couldn't marry Rembrandt because of Saskia's will, which stipulated he'd lose access to Titus's inheritance if he remarried. So they lived together unwed, which created its own problems in Calvinist Amsterdam. In 1654, Hendrikje became pregnant. The Reformed Church summoned her to appear before their council for living in sin with the painter Rembrandt. She was admonished and barred from taking communion, a serious social censure. Rembrandt, interestingly, was never called before the church authorities, perhaps because he was too prominent, or perhaps because they knew he wouldn't come. Hendrikje gave birth to a daughter, Cornelia, named after Rembrandt's mother. Now the household consisted of Rembrandt, his teenage son Titus, his partner Hendrikje, and an infant daughter, all living in the expensive house on Sint Antonisbreestraat that Rembrandt was increasingly unable to afford. Because by the early 1650s the money was running out, the reasons were complex. Amsterdam's art market had changed. The exuberant prosperity of the 1630s and 40s had cooled. Rembrandt's style, never fashionable in the conventional sense, was falling further out of favour. Younger artists were adopting smoother, more classical approaches. Collectors wanted elegance and refinement. Rembrandt was offering psychological intensity and unconventional compositions. His expenses hadn't decreased to match his reduced income. The house required constant maintenance. His collection of art, antiquities, and curiosities kept growing. He attended auctions and bought compulsively suits of armour, exotic shells, paintings by other masters, plaster casts, anything that might be useful for his work or his teaching. He'd also made some bad investments. He'd lent money to people who didn't repay him. He'd speculated on art deals that went wrong. The details are murky, but the result was clear. By the mid-1650s, Rembrandt was deeply in debt to multiple creditors, and he'd run out of ways to avoid paying them. The crisis came in 1656. Rembrandt applied for cessio bonorum, essentially declaring bankruptcy. It wasn't the shameful collapse we might imagine. It was a legal mechanism that allowed him to surrender his assets to be sold by municipal authorities, with the proceeds going to his creditors. He wouldn't go to debtor's prison. He could continue working. But he'd lose everything he'd accumulated over 3 decades. The inventory of his possessions, compiled for the bankruptcy proceedings, is astonishing. Over 300 lots, including paintings, drawings, prints, sculptures, weapons, curiosities, books. The list runs for pages. Reading it is like walking through Rembrandt's mind, seeing what fascinated him, what he collected, what he surrounded himself with. He owned works by Raphael, Giorgione, Palmavecchio, hundreds of prints by Dürer, Lucas van Leiden and other masters, shells and coral, plaster casts of classical sculptures, costumes and theatrical props, weapons and armour, busts of Roman emperors, portfolios of his own drawings and etchings, the accumulated treasury of a working artist's lifetime. All of it was sold at auction in 1657 and 1658. The sales didn't raise enough to satisfy his creditors completely, but they were sufficient to avoid worse consequences. Rembrandt was ruined financially, but remained free to continue working. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because what should have been the end of Rembrandt's career became instead a new beginning. The house on Rozengracht was smaller, simpler, in a less fashionable neighbourhood, but it was theirs, or at least they could afford the rent. And something unexpected happened after the bankruptcy. Rembrandt's work got better, not in spite of the disaster, but perhaps because of it. When you've lost everything except your ability to paint, you focus on what matters. The late 1650s and early 1660s mark a shift in Rembrandt's style. The paintings become darker, more introspective, more emotionally direct, less concerned with showing off technical virtuosity, more interested in capturing something essential about human experience. Take the self-portraits from this period. Rembrandt had been painting himself for decades, but these late self-portraits are different. They're unflinching, an aging man, his face marked by time and hardship, looking directly at the viewer with neither pride nor shame, just presence. The paint is applied differently too, thick, rough, almost sculptural in places. You can see the brushstrokes, the layers building up. It's the opposite of the smooth, polished technique fashionable at the time. It looks unfinished to eyes trained on conventional beauty, but it's more truthful than anything conventionally beautiful could be. He's not hiding anything anymore. Not the wrinkles, not the sagging flesh, not the evidence of a life lived hard. These paintings ask a question that most artists avoid. What does it mean to grow old? What happens when your body betrays you? When your face in the mirror becomes a stranger's face? Rembrandt answers by painting exactly what he sees, with a compassion that never tips into sentimentality. He's not asking for pity. He's documenting the reality of being human in a mortal body. And somehow, in that specificity, in that refusal to idolize or beautify, he creates something universal. The market didn't care. These late self-portraits weren't popular. Collectors wanted elegance, youth, idealized beauty. Rembrandt was offering the opposite. He was painting for himself or for some future audience that didn't exist yet. He'd stopped trying to please anyone. But there were still commissions, fewer than before, but enough. In 1661, he received one of the last major group portrait commissions of his career, the Syndics of the Drapers' Guild, officials responsible for inspecting cloth quality. It should have been straightforward. 5 men sitting at a table, dressed in black, looking dignified. Standard corporate portraiture. Rembrandt made it something else. The men are arranged informally, caught mid-meeting, one of them rising from his chair, another turning to look at someone outside the frame. They're engaged with each other and with us. It's a frozen moment that feels alive, animated by some interaction we've just interrupted. The technical mastery is absolute, the play of light on the fabrics, the individuality of each face, the spatial depth created by the positioning of the figures. But what makes the painting extraordinary is the same thing that made the Night Watch extraordinary 20 years earlier. Rembrandt refuses to treat a group portrait as a collection of heads. He creates a scene, a moment, a glimpse into an ongoing event. The Syndics were pleased. They paid him well. It was one of the last times a group would commission Rembrandt to paint them. The fashion had moved on. Other painters were getting the corporate work, artists who gave clients what they expected without challenging conventions. Meanwhile, Hendrik J. and Titus were running their art-dealing business. Remember, technically, they were Rembrandt's employers now. He worked for them, received board and lodging, and a small allowance. Any paintings he created belonged to their company. This legal fiction protected his income from creditors. It was clever, and it worked. Hendrik J. managed the household finances, dealt with clients, handled the practical matters that Rembrandt had never been good at. She kept them afloat. Titus, now in his early 20s, was learning the business side of art. He had some of his father's talent, but more practical sense. Together, they created a structure that allowed Rembrandt to keep working without the financial pressure that had destroyed him before. The workshop continued too, though on a smaller scale. Students still came to learn from Rembrandt. His reputation as a teacher remained strong even as his reputation as a fashionable artist declined. He'd developed teaching methods that were unusual for the time. Most workshops operated on strict hierarchy and repetition. Students copied the master's work until they could reproduce his style exactly. Rembrandt encouraged something different. He wanted his students to develop their own vision, to experiment, to take risks. He'd set them up in separate rooms in his studio, sometimes with nothing but paper or canvas partitions between them, so they could work independently while still being part of the collective effort. He taught them to observe light obsessively, to notice how it falls on different surfaces, how it creates volume and space, how it can be used to direct the viewer's attention. He'd demonstrate by setting up still lifes with dramatic lighting, single candle sources that created deep shadows and bright highlights. Then he'd have his students paint the same setup, comparing their approaches. Some of his most talented students came through the workshop in these later years. Aert de Gelder studied with him in the 1660s and absorbed Rembrandt's approach so thoroughly that his paintings are sometimes mistaken for his master's work. The influence flowed both ways too. Rembrandt was never too proud to learn from his students, to adopt techniques they discovered, to let their experiments inform his own work. This generosity in teaching, this willingness to share knowledge without hoarding it, was unusual. Many successful artists guarded their methods jealously, seeing students as potential competitors. Rembrandt treated teaching as part of his artistic practice. The workshop was a laboratory where ideas were tested collectively. But teaching didn't pay what it once had. The fees he could charge were lower. There were fewer students, and the income from painting, while steady enough to survive, was nowhere near what he'd earned in the 1630s and 40s. They were getting by, but just barely. Then, in 1662, another major commission arrived. The sampling officials had been successful enough that word spread. A new civic building, the Amsterdam Town Hall, needed paintings. Rembrandt was commissioned to paint The Conspiracy of Claudius Civilis, a massive work depicting a historical scene of Dutch resistance to Roman rule. It was a chance to work at the scale and ambition he'd once been known for. He created something extraordinary. The painting was huge, dominated by a central figure of Claudius Civilis, the one-eyed leader of the revolt, surrounded by conspirators swearing an oath. The lighting was dramatic, almost theatrical. The paint was thick, aggressive, built up in layers that gave the surface a sculptural quality. It was bold, unconventional, powerful. The officials hated it. They'd expected something classical, elegant, appropriate for a prestigious civic building. What they got was raw, violent, disturbing. The one-eyed Civilis looked more like a barbarian than a hero. The oath-swearing scene had a sinister quality rather than noble dignity. It was too much, too intense, too Rembrandt. They rejected it. Rembrandt took the painting back, and in an act that still puzzles scholars, he cut it down. The original was enormous, perhaps 20 feet across. What survives is less than a quarter of that, just the central scene. No one knows what happened to the rest. It might have been destroyed. It might still exist somewhere, lost or misattributed. What remains is in Stockholm now, a fragment of what should have been one of his greatest works. This rejection hurt. Not just financially, though, that mattered, but professionally, personally. He'd put everything into the painting, and the people who commissioned it had found it unacceptable. He was 66 years old. His style, the approach he'd spent a lifetime developing, was being rejected by the very institutions that should have celebrated it. But he kept working. What else could he do? In 1663, Hendrikje died. The cause isn't recorded. She was only 37. She'd been with Rembrandt for 16 years, seen him through bankruptcy and humiliation and rejection, managed his household, borne his child, loved him without condition. Her death was registered at the Westerkerk. She was buried in a rented grave, the kind that gets reused after a few years. No monument, no lasting marker. Rembrandt was devastated. The paintings from after her death show it. They're darker, more sombre even than before. The faces he paints carry a weight of accumulated loss. He'd outlived Saskia, and now Hendrikje. Everyone he'd loved was gone, except Titus and Cornelia. He painted a series of works depicting biblical figures in moments of grief or contemplation. Simeon holding the infant Jesus, knowing he'll die soon. Jacob blessing his children. The prodigal son returning home, collapsing into his father's arms. These weren't just religious paintings, they were meditations on mortality, forgiveness, the burden of survival. The Return of the Prodigal Son, painted sometime in the mid-1660s, is one of his final masterpieces. The composition is simple, a father embracing his son, who kneels before him in rags, having squandered his inheritance and returned home broken. Behind them, figures in shadow watch the scene. The father's face is tender, his hands gentle on his son's back. The son's face is hidden, pressed against his father's chest. We see only his shaved head, his bare feet, his tattered clothes. It's a painting about forgiveness, about unconditional love, about the possibility of redemption even after complete failure. It's impossible not to read Rembrandt's own life into it. The man who'd squandered his wealth, made terrible mistakes, lost everything, and somehow survived. The painting asks whether grace exists, whether we can be forgiven, whether coming home is possible after everything's been destroyed. The paint handling is unlike anything anyone else was doing. Thick impasto in some areas, thin glazes in others, colours that shouldn't work together, somehow creating luminous harmonies. The father's hands are painted with such tenderness that you can feel the weight of them, the comfort they offer. It's a painting about touch, about physical connection, about the body's ability to communicate what words cannot. Rembrandt was working slower now, taking more time with each painting. His eyesight was probably failing. His hands were less steady, but the work was reaching heights it had never touched before. Everything inessential had been stripped away. What remained was pure emotional truth, rendered with a lifetime's accumulated skill. In 1668, Titus got married. He was 26, marrying Magdalena van Loo, the daughter of a silversmith. The wedding took place in February. Rembrandt attended, watched his son take vows, saw him begin a life, separate from the small world they'd occupied together for so long. 7 months later, Titus died. September 1668. He was 27 years old. The cause isn't recorded, probably plague, which swept through Amsterdam periodically, or perhaps one of the other diseases that killed without warning in that era. He was buried in the Westerkerk, the same church where Hendrikje had been laid to rest 5 years earlier. Rembrandt had now outlived both his wives, 3 of his 4 children, and his only surviving son. He was 62 years old. Magdalena was pregnant when Titus died. She gave birth to a daughter in March 1669, naming her Titia after her father. So Rembrandt had a granddaughter he'd never expected to meet, but he wouldn't know her long. The paintings from this final period are extraordinary, not in spite of the suffering, but perhaps because of it. Everything decorative, everything merely skillful, had been burned away. What remained was something more fundamental, an understanding of human vulnerability, so complete it feels almost unbearable to witness. He painted an old man with his hands clasped, eyes closed. The face is weathered, exhausted, but peaceful. The paint is applied with absolute confidence, thick in some areas, thin in others, the brushwork visible, almost careless, yet creating an image of such tenderness it stops you cold. Is it a self-portrait? Maybe. It doesn't matter. It's a portrait of age itself, of survival, of someone who's seen too much and somehow made peace with it. He painted another self-portrait, one of his last. He's laughing, not a bitter laugh, not ironic, genuine laughter, his face creased with it, his eyes nearly closed. It's shocking. After everything, after all the loss and failure and rejection, here's a man laughing. The paint handling is loose, almost wild. You can see where the brush moved across the canvas, building up layers of colour that somehow resolve into flesh, into fabric, into light. The background is completely abstract, just shapes and tones. None of the careful detail of his early work. This is painting reduced to its essence. Colour, light, gesture. Nothing more needed. He'd learned that specificity isn't the same as detail. You don't need to render every thread in a garment to make it feel real. You need to understand how light moves across fabric, how weight pulls at cloth, how a body inhabits its clothes. Paint that understanding and the eye fills in the rest. His technique had become so refined, so intuitive, that he could suggest entire worlds with a few brush strokes. A hand rendered in 3 or 4 marks of the brush, but containing all the information needed to make it completely convincing. This is what mastery looks like. Not adding more, but knowing what to leave out. Knowing exactly how much is enough. The Jewish Bride, painted sometime in the mid to late 1660s, shows a couple. The man's hand rests on the woman's chest, tender and protective. Her hand covers his, accepting the gesture. Their faces are turned slightly toward each other, intimate, private. We're witnessing something we shouldn't be seeing. A moment between 2 people who love each other, who've built a life together, who understand each other completely. The clothing is magnificent, rich reds and golds, painted with thick impasto that catches the light like actual brocade. But the faces are what matter. They're rendered with such psychological depth that you can read entire histories in them. This isn't young love. This is love that's survived time, that's weathered difficulties, that's been tested and proven real. The painting is about partnership, about the quiet strength of long-term commitment, about 2 people who've chosen each other and continue choosing each other. Was Rembrandt thinking of Hendrikje, of Saskia, of relationships he'd had and lost? The painting doesn't answer, it just shows us something true about human connection, rendered with absolute conviction. Vincent van Gogh saw it years later and said he'd give 10 years of his life to sit in front of it for 2 weeks with nothing but a crust of bread to eat. That's the kind of power it has. By 1669, Rembrandt was still working but slowing down. His eyesight was probably failing. His hands weren't as steady. The house on Rozengracht was small, cramped, nothing like the mansion on Jodenbraestraat. He lived there with Cornelia, now 15 years old, and his granddaughter Titia, an infant. Magdalena, Titus's widow, was there too. They were his family now. The people who remained. He painted Simeon in the temple, an old man holding the infant Jesus, knowing he's about to die. Simeon had been promised he wouldn't die until he'd seen the Messiah. Now he holds the child and can finally let go. The painting is about release, about the burden of waiting finally being lifted, about being ready for the end. On October 4th, 1669, Rembrandt van Rijn died. He was 63 years old. The cause of death wasn't recorded. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Westerkerk, the same church where Saskia, Hendrikje and Titus were buried. The grave was rented, not purchased. After a few decades, the remains would be removed to make room for someone else. No monument marks the spot. We don't know where exactly in the church his bones lie. The estate he left was minimal. Some paintings, some furniture, little else. The great collection of art and curiosities was long gone, sold to pay creditors decades earlier. The house on Jodenbraestraat belonged to someone else now. Everything he'd accumulated in his years of success had vanished. What remained was the work, the paintings and etchings scattered across Europe, in private collections and public institutions, the images he'd created, the faces he'd captured, the moments of human experience he'd rendered visible. That was his legacy. Not wealth, not property, not social position, just the work itself. And here's the strange thing. During his lifetime, Rembrandt's reputation declined. The style that made him famous in the 1630s and 40s fell out of fashion. By the time he died, he was seen as old-fashioned, his approach too rough, too dark, too interested in ugly reality instead of ideal beauty. The smooth classical style of painters like Gérard de Layres was what people wanted. Rembrandt's work looked outdated. For the next century, his reputation remained complicated. People acknowledged his early brilliance, but dismissed the late work as the product of failing skill and vision. The thick paint, the loose brushwork, the psychological intensity, these were seen as flaws, evidence of decline. It wasn't until the 19th century that everything shifted. The Romantics discovered him first, artists and writers who valued individual expression, emotional truth, psychological depth. They looked at the late self-portraits and saw not failure but triumph. They understood what he'd been doing, stripping away everything decorative to reveal something more essential. The Impressionists studied his brushwork, his understanding of how paint itself could create light and form. Van Gogh worshipped him. Rembrandt became, posthumously, what he never quite was in life, universally acknowledged as a master, one of the greatest painters who ever lived. Today his work hangs in every major museum. The Night Watch dominates a wall in the Rijksmuseum. The self-portraits are scattered across the world. The Jewish Bride, The Return of the Prodigal Son, the portraits of Saskia and Hendrikje, all of it preserved, studied, endlessly reproduced. But here's what's worth understanding. The greatness wasn't obvious to his contemporaries. They saw someone who'd had success and squandered it, someone whose style became increasingly eccentric and difficult, someone who died poor and largely forgotten. The recognition came later, when enough time had passed for people to see what he'd actually accomplished. When the fashion for smooth classical painting had passed and artists were ready to appreciate something rawer, more psychologically complex. This happens with artists. The work that's most challenging, most ahead of its time, often isn't recognized until decades or centuries later. Rembrandt was painting in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until the 19th century, using techniques, exploring subjects, achieving effects that his own era couldn't process. He was too far ahead. The tragedy is that he knew it. The late paintings show an artist working at the absolute peak of his powers, doing things no one else could do. And he was doing it in poverty and obscurity, rejected by the institutions that should have celebrated him. He kept working anyway. What else could he do? The paintings from his final years don't feel bitter or defeated. They feel hard-won, like he'd gone through everything that could break a person: bankruptcy, humiliation, the loss of everyone he loved, and had come out the other side with something intact. Some core understanding about what it meant to be human. That's what you see in The Return of the Prodigal Son. Not despair, but grace. The possibility of forgiveness, of homecoming, of being accepted despite everything. It's a painting by someone who'd experienced failure completely and was still capable of imagining redemption. The self-portraits track this journey, from the confident young man in fancy dress to the weathered old painter laughing at the absurdity of it all. They're not just documentation of aging, they're philosophical investigations. What remains when everything external is stripped away? What's the self underneath all the performance? These questions weren't academic for Rembrandt. He'd lived them, lost the wealth, the status, the reputation. What he had left was the work and whatever understanding he'd gained from surviving. The technique evolved. Early on, the brushwork was tight, controlled, everything rendered with precision. By the 1650s, he was painting differently. Looser, faster, more gestural. The paint became thick in places, built up in layers, catching light in ways smooth surfaces couldn't. Art historians call this impasto. Rembrandt used it to create texture, dimension, the illusion that light was actually reflecting off a figure's face rather than being painted onto canvas. Look at the details in his late work. The hands in The Jewish Bride aren't carefully delineated, they're suggested. A few strategic brushstrokes that somehow convey more tenderness than perfect anatomical rendering ever could. The fabric in his late portraits isn't meticulously detailed. It's impressionistic, almost abstract up close. But step back and it reads as cloth with weight and texture. This was radical. Most Dutch painters prided themselves on precision, on surfaces so smooth you couldn't see brushstrokes. Rembrandt went the opposite direction. He wanted you to see the paint, to understand that this was a constructed illusion, and somehow that made it feel more real. His students noticed the change. Some followed him into this new territory. Others stuck with the old smooth style that sold better. Because here's the thing about being ahead of your time. The market doesn't follow immediately. The patrons who commissioned portraits wanted polish, refinement. They wanted to look impressive. Rembrandt was increasingly interested in making them look human. The bankruptcy inventory from 1656 lists his possessions, paintings, hundreds of them, prints and drawings, exotic objects, shells, minerals, costumes from different cultures. He'd been collecting obsessively for years, using these objects as props, as teaching tools for his students. Everything went to auction. Most of it sold for less than he'd paid. What the inventory doesn't capture is the psychological weight. Rembrandt had built a life around these objects. They weren't just possessions. They were his visual library, his reference material, his connection to the wider world. Losing them meant losing part of his artistic identity. But necessity forced adaptation. Without the grand house and the extensive collection, he had to work differently. Smaller canvases sometimes, simpler compositions, more focus on faces, on hands, on the elements that actually mattered. The constraints might have improved the work. The relationship with Hendrikje Stoffels stabilized his personal life, even as everything else collapsed. She wasn't educated like Saskia had been, wasn't from a wealthy family, but she was loyal, practical, capable. When the authorities came after his assets, she helped create the legal fiction that let him keep working. She ran the household, managed the business side, dealt with creditors. Their daughter Cornelia was born in 1654. Hendrikje faced public shame for this, summoned before church officials to answer for living in sin. She endured it. Rembrandt couldn't marry her without losing Titus's inheritance from Saskia's will. So they remained technically unmarried, socially suspect, but functionally a family. The paintings of Hendrikje from this period show something different from the portraits of Saskia. Less idealization, more intimacy. She's not posed as a mythological figure or dressed in elaborate costume. She's just herself, bathing, reading, existing. The paint handling is tender, the light soft. These feel like private moments, not public performances. Titus appears in paintings throughout this period too. You can track him growing from child to young man. Rembrandt painted his son repeatedly, trying different costumes, different poses, but always with a gentleness that's unmistakable. The boy who'd lost his mother, watched his father lose everything, but remained devoted. In 1660, Hendrikje and Titus officially formed an art-dealing business. Rembrandt became their employee. It was a legal maneuver, a way to protect his earnings from creditors. But it also must have felt strange. The master painter, one of the most famous artists in Europe, officially working for his teenage son and his partner. He kept painting. The sampling officials came in 1662, one of his last major group commissions. It's different from the Night Watch, quieter, more subdued. The figures are arranged around a table examining cloth. No dramatic action, no theatrical staging, just men doing their job, captured with dignity and precision. The painting shows he could still deliver what commissioners wanted when necessary. But his heart was elsewhere. The biblical scenes from this period go deeper into spiritual territory. The denial of Peter, showing the apostles' moment of betrayal and immediate regret. The conspiracy of Claudius Civilis, depicting a legendary Dutch rebellion, though the painting was rejected and later cut down by Rembrandt himself. That rejection stung. He'd painted a massive canvas for Amsterdam's new town hall, a prestigious commission that should have restored his reputation. Instead, the city fathers found it too dark, too rough, not heroic enough. They wanted something more in line with current fashion. Rembrandt gave them psychological complexity and moral ambiguity. They wanted propaganda. The painting that remains, a fragment of the original, shows figures taking an oath by candlelight. The lighting is extraordinary. The faces emerging from darkness with uncanny presence. But you can see why it didn't please the commissioners. It's strange, unsettling, the kind of painting that demands attention rather than providing easy satisfaction. This pattern repeated. Rembrandt would receive a commission, produce something brilliant but not quite what was wanted, face disappointment or rejection. The gap between his vision and public taste kept widening. Most artists would have adjusted. Rembrandt doubled down. The late self-portraits become almost confrontational. Here I am, they seem to say. Old, worn down, unfashionable, but still here, still making art. Some show him laughing, others serious, a few almost haunted. They're not trying to flatter or impress. They're documents of endurance. What was he thinking during these years? The letters that survive don't tell us. They're mostly business correspondence, requests for payment, practical matters. The inner life remains hidden, visible only through the paintings themselves. But you can make inferences. Someone who keeps painting at this level, through poverty and obscurity, isn't motivated by money or fame. Those were gone. What remained was the work itself, the daily practice of looking and making, of translating vision into paint. That had to be enough because it was all he had left. The house on Rosengracht, where they lived after the bankruptcy, was modest. 3 stories, respectable but not grand. Rembrandt set up his studio there, continued teaching a few students. The workshop was smaller now, less prestigious, but still functioning. Young painters still wanted to learn from him, even if fashionable Amsterdam had moved on. His technique kept evolving. The paint got even looser in places, almost sculptural. He'd build up thick passages of lead white for highlights, let them catch actual light, and throw tiny shadows. The effect created luminosity that flat painting couldn't match. Stand close to a late Rembrandt and it's almost abstract. Step back and everything resolves into perfect clarity. This wasn't decline, it was refinement. Everything inessential falling away until only the core remained. The ability to capture a face, a gesture, a moment of emotional truth with maximum economy and maximum impact. That's what the late work does. Every element earns its place. The Jewish Bride, painted around 1665, shows a couple in what appears to be a tender moment. The man's hand rests on the woman's chest, protective, intimate. Her hand covers his. The identities are uncertain. Some scholars think it's Isaac and Rebecca. Others suggest a contemporary couple in costume. The ambiguity doesn't matter. What matters is the emotion. The paint handling is extraordinary. The woman's sleeve is built up with thick impasto, golden yellow, catching light. You could almost touch the fabric. The faces are softer, more blended, but no less present. The couple exists in a golden atmosphere, isolated from the world, complete in themselves. Vincent van Gogh saw this painting and said you'd give 10 years of your life just to sit in front of it for 2 weeks with nothing but a crust of bread for food. He understood what Rembrandt had achieved, something beyond technique, beyond skill, a kind of visual poetry that spoke directly to the soul. The return of the prodigal son came even later, probably in the final year or 2 of Rembrandt's life. It's based on the biblical parable. The son who squandered his inheritance returns home, broken and destitute. The father welcomes him back with open arms, unconditional forgiveness. The painting is large, the figures life-size. The son kneels, his back to us, head against his father's chest. The father's hands rest on the son's shoulders, tender and protective. Surrounding figures watch, their reactions mixed. Some seem moved, others skeptical, but the focus is that embrace. The father's face shows infinite compassion. The son's bare feet, visible at the bottom of the canvas are damaged, worn from the journey. The red robe draped over his shoulders is ragged. Every detail speaks of suffering and acceptance, of judgment withheld, of a love that persists despite everything. Rembrandt knew something about squandered inheritance by then, about returning home diminished, about hoping for acceptance despite failure. The painting feels personal in ways that transcend the biblical source. It's about the human need for forgiveness, for homecoming, for the possibility that our worst mistakes don't define us forever. Hendrickje died in 1663, probably from plague. Titus died in 1668, just months after marrying. He was 26. Rembrandt buried his son, the last connection to Saskia, the boy who'd survived when 3 others hadn't. What that loss did to him we can only imagine. He kept painting. What else was there? His daughter-in-law Magdalena was pregnant. The baby, also named Titus, would be born after Rembrandt's death. But in those final months, he was alone except for Cornelia, his daughter with Hendrickje, still a child. The late works show no falling off in quality. If anything, they intensify. Simeon with the Christ child in the temple, painted around 1669, shows the old prophet holding the infant Jesus, recognizing him as the Messiah. Simeon's face is ecstatic, illuminated from within. The paint is loose, quick, confident. The hand of someone who'd been doing this for 50 years and knew exactly what every brushstroke should accomplish. Rembrandt died on October 4th, 1669. He was 63. The cause isn't recorded. The burial registry at the Westerkerk notes simply that Rembrandt van Rijn, painter, was interred. No elaborate monument, no public ceremony. Just another death in a city that saw many. The estate he left was minimal. Some furniture, a few paintings, not much else. Cornelia inherited what little there was. The great house was long gone, the collection dispersed. The fame that had once surrounded him had faded to near invisibility, but the paintings remained, scattered across Amsterdam and beyond, in private collections and public buildings. The night watch still hung where it had been placed decades earlier, though people had stopped really seeing it. The portraits and biblical scenes were filed away, their power dormant, waiting. It took time for the reassessment. Decades first, then a century. The 18th century still didn't know what to make of him. Too rough, too dark, not classical enough. But something was shifting. A few artists and critics began to recognize what he'd accomplished. The 19th century changed everything. Romanticism arrived with its emphasis on individual genius, emotional depth, psychological complexity. Suddenly Rembrandt's rough surfaces and dramatic shadows weren't flaws. They were revolutionary techniques that had anticipated everything the Romantics valued. French artists discovered him first. Delacroix studied the prints, learning how Rembrandt could suggest entire worlds with a few etched lines. The British followed. Reynolds had already admired him, but now younger painters were making pilgrimages to see the works scattered across European collections. Something fundamental was shifting in how people understood art. The classical ideal of smooth finish and noble subject matter was giving way to something more emotionally immediate. Rembrandt's paintings, with their visible brushstrokes and unglamorous subjects, suddenly looked modern rather than primitive. The self-portraits became particularly fascinating to this new audience. Here was an artist who documented his own face across 4 decades with unflinching honesty. Young Rembrandt, confident and ambitious. Middle-aged Rembrandt at the height of his powers. Old Rembrandt, marked by loss and failure, but still painting. No artist had done this before, not with this consistency or psychological depth. The self-portraits weren't just records of physical appearance, they were studies in human vulnerability, aging, dignity despite decline. The Romantic era, obsessed with artistic genius and individual consciousness, found in these paintings a mirror for their own preoccupations. Vincent van Gogh would later write about Rembrandt with reverence that bordered on worship. Van Gogh saw in those late self-portraits something he recognized: the artist as a kind of holy fool, someone who'd sacrificed everything for his vision and emerged with something transcendent. The rehabilitation wasn't immediate or universal. Academic painters still preferred smooth technique and classical subjects. But the tide was turning. Museums began actively seeking Rembrandt paintings. Private collectors competed for them. Prices rose. By the late 19th century, Rembrandt had been fully canonized. He was now considered one of the absolute masters, ranked alongside Michelangelo and Leonardo. The rough provincial who died in obscurity had become an immortal. What had changed? Not the paintings themselves. They'd been sitting in collections all along, ignored or undervalued. What changed was the criteria by which people judged art. Once you valued emotional authenticity over classical perfection, once you cared about psychological depth more than noble subject matter, Rembrandt's achievement became visible. The night watch, which had been trimmed and relegated to a side room, was moved to a place of honour. People stood before it trying to understand how Rembrandt had created such dynamic movement, such drama from what should have been a stiff group portrait. The biblical paintings, dismissed as too dark and theatrical, were now seen as profound meditations on human suffering and grace. The Jewish bride, barely noticed for centuries, became recognised as one of the most tender depictions of love in Western art. Scholars began the work of cataloguing everything: paintings, drawings, etchings, separating authentic Rembrandts from workshop productions and later forgeries. This wasn't simple. Rembrandt had run a large workshop. His students painted in his style, sometimes so successfully that even experts couldn't tell the difference. The Rembrandt Research Project, established in 1968, took on the massive task of examining every painting attributed to Rembrandt using scientific methods: X-rays, infrared photography, paint analysis. They downgraded many works from authentic to workshop or follower. The total number of accepted paintings shrank from over 600 to around 300. This caused controversy. Collectors who thought they owned Rembrandts discovered they owned workshop pieces worth a fraction of the price. Museums had to relabel paintings. The art market convulsed. But the research also revealed extraordinary things. Technical analysis showed how Rembrandt built up his paintings layer by layer, how he used the rough canvas texture in some areas while applying thick impasto in others, how he'd sometimes paint with the back of his brush, scratching into wet paint to create texture. X-rays revealed earlier compositions hidden beneath finished works, changes of mind, adjustments, abandoned ideas. The paintings weren't finished objects, dropped fully formed from the artist's imagination. They were records of process, thinking, revision. The etchings, already highly valued, became objects of obsessive scholarly attention. Rembrandt had been his own printer, pulling impressions from his copper plates. He'd experimented constantly, trying different papers, inks, techniques. He'd rework plates, adding or removing elements, creating multiple states of the same image. Collectors became fascinated by these variations: first state, second state, third state, each one slightly different, showing Rembrandt's evolving vision. A complete set of states for a major etching could tell a story about how he thought, how he solved problems, what he was trying to achieve. The technical mastery was undeniable, the way he could suggest an entire landscape with a few quick lines. The way he used dry point, a technique where the burr left by the tool holds ink and creates a rich, velvety black. The way he understood that what you leave out is as important as what you include. 3 crosses, one of his late etchings, shows Christ crucified between 2 thieves. The first state is relatively straightforward, detailed but not overwhelming. But Rembrandt kept working the plate, and in the 4th state, he transformed it completely. Heavy diagonal shading plunges most of the scene into darkness. Christ emerges from this darkness, illuminated, while chaos swirls around him. It's one of the most dramatic images in printmaking, and it shows an artist still pushing boundaries in his 60s. The drawings presented their own challenges. Thousands survive, scattered across collections worldwide. Some are clearly preparatory studies for paintings or etchings. Others are independent works, finished compositions in themselves. Still others are quick sketches, ideas captured before they evaporated. Rembrandt drew constantly, on whatever paper was available. In chalk, ink, wash. He drew from life, from imagination, from other artists' works. His drawings of elephants came from sketching animals brought to Amsterdam from distant lands. His biblical scenes came from memory and meditation. The spontaneity of the drawings reveals something the paintings sometimes obscure. How quickly he thought, how directly he translated vision into mark-making. A few lines suggest a face. A wash of ink creates atmosphere. There's no labouring, no second-guessing visible in the marks themselves. Modern audiences sometimes struggle with the paintings. They're dark, literally. Centuries of varnish and dirt have obscured them. Cleaning is controversial because removing old varnish risks damaging the paint beneath. But even when properly cleaned, Rembrandt's paintings remain darker than most old masters. That's intentional. The shadows matter as much as the light. The technique itself can seem crude compared to the smooth finish of academic painting. You can see brush strokes. Paint is built up thickly in some areas, thinly in others. Faces might be rendered in careful detail, while clothing is suggested with a few rough strokes. This looks unfinished to eyes trained on classical perfection. But that's the point. Rembrandt understood something fundamental about how we actually see. We don't perceive everything with equal clarity. Our eyes focus on what matters, the face, the gesture, the emotional centre of a scene, while peripheral details remain vague. His technique mimics this selective attention. The rough surfaces also have a physical presence that smooth painting lacks. Light hits the thick impasto differently, creating a sense of texture and three-dimensionality. The paintings aren't just images, they're objects with their own material reality. Contemporary artists recognized this immediately. Painters in the 20th century who were pushing against academic tradition found in Rembrandt a predecessor. He'd already demonstrated that visible brushwork could be more expressive than invisible technique. That darkness and shadow were compositional tools, not failures of illumination. That psychological truth mattered more than physical beauty. Francis Bacon studied Rembrandt's portraits. Lucian Freud did too. They saw in those faces a refusal to idealize, a commitment to showing human beings as they actually were, flawed, aging, vulnerable. This wasn't cruelty. It was a kind of compassion, an acknowledgement that we're all struggling through existence as best we can. The self-portraits became particularly important to modern artists. The idea that you could use your own face as subject matter repeatedly, documenting time's passage and life's accumulated weight, offered a model for artistic practice that felt deeply relevant. Van Gogh had done it. Picasso would do it. Rembrandt had shown the way. Your own face becomes a laboratory where you can experiment with technique, expression, honesty. The self-portrait isn't narcissism. It's the most available model, always present, never complaining about long sessions. Museums around the world now consider their Rembrandt holdings among their greatest treasures. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam built an entire wing around the Night Watch. The Frick Collection in New York centres on their Rembrandt self-portrait. The National Gallery in London guards their paintings like crown jewels. Private collectors still compete for any Rembrandt that comes to market, though few do. Most are locked away in museums or foundations. When one appears at auction, the prices are astronomical, not just because they're rare, but because they represent something beyond market value. They're connections to genius, to a sensibility that transcended its own time and speaks directly to ours. The financial irony isn't lost on anyone. Rembrandt died nearly broke, his possessions sold off, his reputation diminished. Now his paintings sell for tens of millions. The house where he lived in poverty is a museum. The bankruptcy that humiliated him is a historical footnote to a career now seen as one of the greatest in Western art. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Do we value his late work more because we know about his suffering? Would the paintings mean less if he died wealthy and comfortable? Is our response to the art inseparable from the biography, or does the work stand on its own, regardless of context? There's no clean answer. The paintings existed before we knew the life story, and they'll exist after we've forgotten it. But knowing that the return of the prodigal son was painted by a man who'd lost everything adds resonance. The father's acceptance of his wayward son feels more poignant when you know Rembrandt was, in some sense, painting his own need for forgiveness and homecoming. The technical achievement alone would secure Rembrandt's reputation, but technique serves vision, and Rembrandt's vision was fundamentally about what it means to be human, vulnerable, struggling, marked by time and loss, but capable of dignity, compassion, transcendence. That's why the work survives. That's why it matters, not because it's old or famous or expensive, but because it shows us ourselves with uncommon clarity. The faces in his paintings aren't idealized, they're real people, complete with flaws and damage, and somehow that makes them more beautiful, not less. He painted himself one last time in 1669. The face looking back from the canvas is almost unrecognizable from the young man who'd stared out from those early self-portraits. The flesh sags. The eyes have seen too much, but there's something else there too. Not defeat exactly, maybe acceptance, maybe exhaustion, maybe just the quiet knowledge that time had finally caught up with him. Rembrandt died on October 4th, 1669. He was 63 years old. The cause of death wasn't recorded, probably one of the countless illnesses that swept through Amsterdam regularly. Maybe just the accumulated weight of 6 decades of living hard and working harder. His funeral was simple. A handful of people attended. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the Westerkerk, the same church where his son Titus had been buried just a year earlier. The location of the grave itself is lost now. Somewhere beneath the church's floor lies the body of one of history's greatest artists, and nobody knows exactly where. The estate inventory tells us what he left behind. Not much. Some clothes, basic furniture, painting supplies. His daughter Cornelia inherited what little there was. The house was long gone, sold at auction years earlier. The collections dispersed. The wealth accumulated during those prosperous decades had evaporated completely. Contemporary obituaries barely noticed his passing. A few lines in local papers, some mention in art circles. Nothing suggesting that anyone understood they'd lost a giant. His style had fallen out of fashion decades earlier. By the time he died, he was seen as a relic from an earlier era, technically accomplished but artistically outdated. The years immediately following his death saw his reputation sink even further. The next generation of Dutch painters worked in a completely different mode. Smoother surfaces, more refined technique, classical restraint. Everything Rembrandt's late work wasn't. His paintings sold, but for modest prices. People bought them as curiosities from the previous generation, not as masterpieces. The 18th century brought partial rehabilitation. Collectors began recognizing something special in those late works. The psychological depth, the technical mastery beneath the apparent roughness. Prices started climbing. Museums began acquiring major pieces. But he still wasn't considered the equal of the Italian Renaissance masters or even some of his own contemporaries. The real transformation came in the 19th century. Romantic artists and writers discovered in Rembrandt a kindred spirit, someone who'd suffered for his art, someone who'd rejected commercial success in favour of personal vision. The biography became as important as the paintings. This tragic genius, dying alone and poor, became irresistible to the romantic imagination. Vincent van Gogh worshipped him. Van Gogh saw in those self-portraits a model for his own unflinching self-examination. He wrote about Rembrandt constantly in his letters, analysing the technique, studying the use of light. When Van Gogh painted himself, he was following Rembrandt's lead, documenting his own psychological journey through portraiture. The 19th century also brought systematic scholarship. Art historians began cataloguing Rembrandt's complete works. Attributions were questioned. Workshop pieces were separated from autograph paintings. The Rembrandt Research Project, started in the 20th century, would spend decades using scientific analysis to determine which paintings were actually by the master's hand. This authentication work remains controversial. The project initially rejected paintings that had been considered genuine Rembrandts for centuries. Later research sometimes reversed these decisions. The debate continues because Rembrandt ran such a large workshop and because his students were so skilled at copying his style. Some paintings exist in a grey area where experts disagree about the extent of Rembrandt's personal involvement, but certain works are undisputed. The Night Watch, The Jewish Bride, The Sampling Officials, the late self-portraits, The Return of the Prodigal Son. These paintings represent the undeniable core of his achievement. Nobody questions their authorship or their importance. Museums built entire galleries around these works. The Rijksmuseum designed their floor plan to lead visitors inevitably toward the Night Watch. The Frick Collection in New York centered their permanent installation on their Rembrandt self-portrait. The National Gallery in London positioned their Rembrandts as highlights of the entire collection. The 20th century brought new waves of interpretation. Modernist critics appreciated the painterly surfaces, the visible brushwork, the rejection of photographic realism. Here was an artist treating paint as a material substance with its own properties, not just a tool for creating illusions. This aligned perfectly with modernist principles. Psychoanalytic approaches found in the self-portraits a visual record of psychological development and aging. The paintings documented not just physical changes, but emotional and spiritual evolution. This made them uniquely valuable for understanding the interior life of a 17th century artist. Social historians examined Rembrandt's work for evidence about Dutch culture. The paintings showed how people dressed, how they furnished their homes, how they understood religion and morality. The Night Watch revealed the structure of civic militia companies. The group portraits documented merchant organizations. Even the biblical scenes reflected contemporary Dutch life more than ancient Middle Eastern culture. Feminist scholars complicated the biographical narrative. The treatment of Geertje Dirks looked considerably worse through a modern lens. The power dynamics with Hendrik Stoffels raised questions. The paintings of women, while often sympathetic, still reflected patriarchal assumptions about female beauty and virtue. This didn't diminish the art, but it contextualized the artist. Technical analysis using modern scientific methods revealed Rembrandt's working process in unprecedented detail. X-rays showed how he changed compositions as he painted. Infrared reflectography revealed underdrawings. Chemical analysis identified pigments and binding media. These studies confirmed what had long been suspected from visual examination. Rembrandt experimented constantly, revising as he went, building up surfaces in complex layers. The discovery of his etching techniques through examination of different states of prints showed similar working methods. He'd pull a proof, study it, then rework the plate. Sometimes he made dozens of changes before considering a print finished. The etchings weren't reproductions of finished designs. They were experimental works where the medium itself generated new ideas. Contemporary artists continue finding inspiration in Rembrandt's example. The British painter Frank Auerbach studied those late portraits for decades, trying to understand how Rembrandt achieved such psychological presence through purely painterly means. Lucian Freud cited Rembrandt's influence on his own unflinching portraits. Photographers like Richard Avedon referenced Rembrandt lighting in their work. Film directors borrowed his compositional strategies, the dramatic chiaroscuro, the spotlight effect, the way secondary figures emerge from shadow. These techniques translated directly to cinema. You can see Rembrandt's influence in everything from film noir to contemporary prestige dramas. Writers used him as a character or reference point. His life became the subject of novels and plays. The poverty and neglect, the artistic integrity, the complicated personal life. It all made for compelling drama, even if the details were often fictionalized for narrative purposes. The house on Jodenbraestraat, the one he lost in bankruptcy, became a museum in 1911. Visitors can now walk through rooms where he painted the Night Watch. They can see his studio space, his collections of curiosities, his etching press. The museum recreates the environment where he produced his greatest works. The irony of his financial failure has become part of his legend. The man died nearly bankrupt. Now his paintings are literally priceless. When a work attributed to Rembrandt appears at auction, it makes international news. The prices set records. In 2009, a pair of portraits sold for $180 million. The market value reflects not just rarity or beauty, but cultural significance accumulated over centuries. This raises questions about how we value art. Is a painting more valuable because the artist suffered? Would we care less if Rembrandt had died wealthy and comfortable? The art itself hasn't changed. The pigments are the same, the brushstrokes identical. But knowing the biography colours our response. Perhaps that's inevitable. We don't experience art in a vacuum. We bring everything we know to our encounters with it. The fact that The Return of the Prodigal Son was painted by a man who'd lost nearly everything adds resonance. The father's acceptance becomes more moving when you know Rembrandt was, in some sense, painting his own need for homecoming. But the paintings also work without that knowledge. They worked for their original viewers who knew nothing of Rembrandt's future poverty. They work for viewers today who never learn his biography. The power is in the images themselves. The light, the faces, the humanity rendered visible through paint on canvas. That's the real achievement, not the tragic biography, not the financial failures or personal complications, the paintings, the etchings, the drawings. These objects that continue speaking across 4 centuries because they captured something essential about human experience. Standing in front of a late Rembrandt portrait, you're not looking at a historical artifact. You're looking at a human being who lived and suffered and thought and felt. The paint becomes transparent. You see through it to the person beneath. That's the magic Rembrandt achieved, and that no amount of technical analysis fully explains. He painted light emerging from darkness. He painted faces that refused to lie about age or mortality. He painted human vulnerability without sentimentality and human dignity without idealization. He showed us ourselves as we actually are, flawed and struggling, and somehow magnificent despite it all. The miller's son from Leiden, who signed his paintings with only his first name, positioning himself as the equal of Leonardo and Michelangelo, wasn't wrong. 400 years later, we still speak of him the same way. Just Rembrandt, no other identification necessary. That's how you know you've achieved something permanent. When your name alone carries the weight of everything you created. Standing before a Rembrandt painting today, you're seeing something that shouldn't exist. The man who created it died in poverty. His reputation was already fading. The style that made him famous had fallen completely out of fashion. Those thick brushstrokes, that dramatic lighting, that refusal to prettify his subjects, all of it looked outdated to his contemporaries. They wanted smooth surfaces and classical restraint. Rembrandt gave them psychological complexity, rendered in rough, urgent paint. The intervening centuries changed how we see. What looked like decline to 18th century eyes looks like mastery to ours. The technical innovations that confused his contemporaries became the foundation for how modern artists think about paint itself. The emotional directness that seemed crude became the standard we measure honesty against. But here's what matters more than any posthumous vindication. Rembrandt kept working. Through bankruptcy, through the deaths of everyone he loved, through professional rejection and social scandal, he kept painting. Not because he expected recognition. He'd already watched his reputation crumble. Not because he needed the money, though he did. He kept painting because it was what he did. The only thing that made sense when everything else had fallen apart. The late self-portraits document this. An old man staring back from the canvas with neither pride nor shame, just presence, the accumulated weight of 6 decades visible in every line of his face. These aren't flattering. They're not trying to impress anyone. They're simply true, and that truth cuts deeper than any idealized beauty could manage. You can track the evolution if you look at the work chronologically. The young Rembrandt, confident and ambitious, painting himself in fancy costumes and dramatic lighting. The successful Rembrandt at mid-career, technically brilliant, sought after by wealthy clients. Then the late Rembrandt, stripped of everything except his ability to see clearly and render what he saw with absolute conviction. The technique itself tells the story. Early work is tight, controlled, showing off skill. Late work is looser, faster, more direct. The paint becomes a physical presence on the canvas rather than a transparent window. You see the brushstrokes. You understand this is an illusion being constructed, and somehow that makes it feel more real, not less. This wasn't regression. It was refinement, everything decorative falling away until only essentials remained. A few marks suggesting a hand, thick impasto catching light like actual fabric. Faces rendered with such psychological depth that you forget you're looking at paint on canvas and start believing you're seeing an actual person. Modern painters recognized this immediately. Van Gogh studied those late portraits obsessively, trying to understand how Rembrandt achieved such presence through purely painterly means. Francis Bacon saw in those faces a refusal to idealize that aligned with his own brutal honesty. Lucian Freud found permission to paint flesh as it actually exists, sagging and imperfect, and somehow more moving than any classical perfection. The paintings survived because they addressed something permanent, not fashion or taste, which shift constantly, something more fundamental. What it means to age, what it means to lose everything, what it means to keep going anyway. These aren't historical curiosities. They're active documents, still asking questions we haven't finished answering. Consider what we've inherited from this one man. The idea that painting visible brushstrokes is more honest than hiding them. The understanding that darkness matters as much as light. The recognition that psychological truth trumps physical beauty. The belief that faces should reveal character, not just features. All of this traces back to decisions Rembrandt made while working in obscurity, rejected by the institutions that should have celebrated him. He changed how light works in painting. Before Rembrandt, chiaroscuro was a technique among techniques. After him, it became a way of structuring vision itself. The spotlight effect he perfected, that dramatic beam illuminating a face, while everything else recedes into shadow, became so fundamental to visual culture that we barely notice it anymore. It's how we light films, how we shoot portraits, how we instinctively imagine drama itself. The self-portrait as autobiography, that's Rembrandt too. Artists had painted themselves before, but not like this. Not as a sustained investigation across decades. Not with this level of psychological honesty. He turned his own face into a laboratory for exploring what time does to a person. What experience writes on flesh. What remains when everything external is stripped away. His teaching methods, encouraging students to develop their own vision, rather than simply copying his style, that approach eventually became standard. But in 17th century Amsterdam, it was radical. Most workshops operated on pure imitation. Rembrandt wanted something different. Individual expression, within a shared technical foundation. The tension between those two principles, mastery of craft and personal vision, defines art education even now. The financial story remains instructive. Rembrandt earned a fortune and lost it completely. Not through bad luck alone, through spending compulsively on things that mattered to him. Collections, art supplies, objects that fed his work. He prioritized making great paintings over maintaining financial security. That choice destroyed him economically. It also produced The Jewish Bride and The Return of the Prodigal Son. Would we trade those paintings for a version of Rembrandt who died wealthy and comfortable? The question answers itself. The work matters more than the man's comfort. That sounds brutal. It is brutal. Art doesn't care about the artist's well-being. The paintings exist independent of whether their creator thrived or suffered. They're what remains after everything personal has dissolved. Museums understand this. They preserve the work, not the life. The Night Watch hangs in the Rijksmuseum behind climate-controlled glass, protected by security systems, monitored constantly. The man who painted it lies in an unmarked grave somewhere beneath the Westerkerk. We know where the painting is. We've lost track of the body. That tells you what survives and what doesn't. But the paintings carry traces of the life anyway. You can't separate them completely. The Return of the Prodigal Son, painted by a comfortable academic, would be technically accomplished and emotionally hollow. The same composition by someone who'd actually lost everything, who knew what it meant to need forgiveness and homecoming, becomes something else entirely. The paint itself seems to carry that knowledge. The late work resists easy consumption. These aren't pretty pictures you hang on a wall and forget about. They demand attention. They ask you to look at age, at failure, at human vulnerability without the comfort of easy answers. The faces refuse to lie. The darkness refuses to resolve into light. The paint surface refuses to disappear into illusion. That difficulty is the point. Rembrandt in his final years wasn't trying to please anyone. He'd watched his attempt to please patrons fail repeatedly. The conspiracy of Claudius Civilis rejected, the reputation declining, the commissions drying up. He'd learned that commercial success required compromises he was no longer willing to make. So he painted what he saw, as honestly as he could see it, and let the consequences land where they would. The consequences were poverty and obscurity. Also mastery. Those things aren't contradictory, they're connected. The freedom to paint without concern for market demands produced work that transcended market logic entirely. The paintings became valuable precisely because they weren't created for value. They were created for truth. Understanding this requires accepting something uncomfortable about how art works. The suffering doesn't cause the greatness. Plenty of people suffer without producing anything of value. But the willingness to keep working through suffering, to use the experience rather than be destroyed by it, that can deepen the work in ways comfort never could. Rembrandt painted The Jewish Bride after Hendrikje died. That tender image of two people who've chosen each other, who understand each other completely, comes from someone who just lost exactly that kind of partnership. The painting isn't about his grief. It's about what he'd learned through having and losing. The knowledge in those brushstrokes comes from living through something irreplaceable. We're still learning from those lessons. Contemporary artists studying Rembrandt aren't doing antiquarian research. They're looking for practical knowledge. How do you paint a face that feels psychologically present? How do you structure light to create drama? How do you know when to add detail and when to leave things suggested? The answers are there in the paintings, visible to anyone willing to look carefully enough. The etchings contain their own lessons. How much can you suggest with minimal means? How do you create atmosphere using nothing but black ink on white paper? How do you revise an image across multiple states, improving it through iteration rather than trying to get it perfect in one attempt? Rembrandt's prints show a working process that remains relevant to anyone making images in any medium. The drawings reveal something else, speed, confidence, the ability to capture a gesture or expression in seconds. No hesitation, no second guessing. Just direct translation from eye to hand to paper. That fluency comes from decades of practice, but it also requires trust in your own perception. Rembrandt trusted what he saw, even when it contradicted conventional wisdom about how things should look. This brings us back to the central question. How does a miller's son from a provincial Dutch city become one of the most important artists in Western history? The superficial answer involves talent, training, opportunity, but those explain competence, not genius. Plenty of talented, well-trained artists with good opportunities produce forgettable work. What distinguished Rembrandt was something harder to quantify. A refusal to accept received wisdom about what painting should do or how it should look. A commitment to seeing clearly rather than seeing what you're supposed to see. A willingness to keep pushing deeper even when the market rewarded surface polish. An understanding that technical mastery should serve vision, not replace it. He also had timing. Born too early or too late, his approach wouldn't have worked. The 17th century Dutch art market, with its wealthy merchant class and appetite for portraits, provided exactly the economic foundation he needed to develop his skills. The religious and political context of Amsterdam, relatively tolerant by contemporary standards, gave him freedom to explore subjects and techniques that might have been impossible elsewhere. But timing and context only create possibility. Rembrandt converted possibility into achievement through decades of sustained work. No shortcuts, no tricks, just showing up every day, looking at the world and trying to render what he saw with increasing honesty and skill. The glamorous parts of his story, the early success and wealthy clients, matter less than this daily commitment to the work itself. The bankruptcy, viewed this way, becomes almost necessary. Not something to celebrate, but something that stripped away distractions. When you lose everything except your ability to paint, you find out what painting actually means to you. For Rembrandt, it meant everything. More than financial security, more than social position, more than contemporary approval. The work itself became the point. This obsessive focus produced paintings that continue functioning 4 centuries later because they weren't designed for their own moment. They were designed to be true. And truth, unlike fashion, doesn't expire. The faces Rembrandt painted in the 1660s remain faces we recognize. The emotions he captured remain emotions we feel. The questions his work asks remain questions worth considering. Walk through any major museum and you'll see how subsequent centuries tried to match what he achieved. Some came close, many failed completely. The smooth academic painting that replaced his approach in the 18th century now looks dated, overly polished, emotionally sterile. Rembrandt's rough surfaces and psychological depth have aged better than technique that seemed more accomplished at the time. The market eventually recognized this. Paintings that sold for modest sums in the 18th century now command prices that would have seemed insane even 50 years ago. The financial rehabilitation is complete. But it's also irrelevant. The paintings don't care what they're worth. They exist independent of valuation, doing what they've always done, showing us faces, moments, emotions rendered with absolute conviction. You can see this conviction in every brushstroke. The thick impasto wasn't applied tentatively. It's aggressive, confident, certain of its purpose. The shadows aren't apologetic. They're structural elements, as important as the light. The psychological intensity isn't softened for easy consumption. It's presented directly, demanding engagement rather than passive viewing. This directness makes the work challenging. You can't treat a late Rembrandt portrait as decoration. It won't fade into the background. It insists on being seen, on being reckoned with. The faces look back at you with an intensity that can feel uncomfortable. They're not performing. They're just there, present, refusing to be anything other than what they are. That refusal to perform, to prettify, to make things easier than they actually are. That's what survives. Everything decorative falls away. What remains is essential. Human beings rendered with such clarity that centuries become irrelevant. You're not looking at a 17th century Dutch painting. You're looking at a person, and that person is looking back at you, across 400 years, asking whether you're willing to see clearly. The answer determines whether Rembrandt's achievement matters to you personally or remains just historical significance, something to acknowledge without actually feeling. Because the paintings aren't museum pieces demanding reverent distance. They're active objects still doing work, still asking questions, still demonstrating what's possible when someone commits completely to seeing and rendering truth. Rembrandt died thinking he'd failed. His style was unfashionable. His reputation had declined. The wealth was gone. The acclaim had faded. By conventional measures, his career ended in failure. But he left behind paintings that changed how humans understand light, faces, aging, vulnerability. He created images that remain more psychologically acute than most photography. He demonstrated that honesty matters more than beauty, that truth outlasts fashion, that work done with complete commitment survives long after the worker himself is forgotten.